Week 3 is officially here, and today I got you guys covered with my top 40 wide receiver rankings tier list. I bring you guys every single week for fantasy football, but before we get into the official top 40, we go through the will they play tier. And the two main guys on the will they play tier this week, Jauan Jennings, wide receiver of the San Francisco 49ers, and Xavier Worthy, wide receiver of the Kansas City Chiefs. Actually, at the time I'm recording this, Xavier Worthy was just announced as out for this Week 3 game. And as we see from this tweet over on Twitter from Deepak, we do see that the average return timeline is about 3 weeks, and he does say that there's a high re-injury risk for the rest of the season. So to me, if you have Xavier Worthy, view him as more of a boom-bust wide receiver 3, given the status of that current shoulder injury. Again, you're not going to have him for this week. More so talking about from a long-term perspective. As the season goes along, top 30th level wide receiver. I want to be more bullish than that, but the shoulder is a real scare. Jauan Jennings, wide receiver of the San Francisco 49ers, also dealing with his own shoulder injury, and I mean, it's to be determined at this point. He didn't play throughout the week. He didn't practice throughout the week. I am leaning on the side of him being out in this game. The data also favors that. We do see this from Deepak. Status is to be determined, but the data does favor sitting for Jauan Jennings. So if you do have Jauan Jennings, you do have Xavier Worthy, be prepared to be without them this week. But moving on to my first tier of wide receiver this week, and this tier consists of 4 names at the top. Number 1, CeeDee Lamb. Number 2, Puka Nacua. Number 3, Amon-Ra St. Brown. And number 4, Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. We will start off with my boy CeeDee Lamb. Very, very good game environment going on the road to play the Chicago Bears. And in the first 2 games of the Cowboys year, we see 19.1 PPR points per game for CeeDee Lamb, despite leaving plays on the field. Like if you guys do remember in week 1, a lot of meat left on the bone. I believe there was a stat that was tweeted from ESPN. Left about 15 PPR points on the field against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now gets a Bears defense that was just mopped for 52 points. They had no answers for the Lions offense last week, and they will be without their top 2 corners and 3 of their 4 best corners. Jalen Johnson, Kyler Gordon, and Jalen Jones will all be out for this game. And their current cornerback, one Tyreek Stevenson, has a perfect passer rating when targeted against. That's not very good. This is the second highest game total of the week, and the Chicago Bears secondary is absolutely decimated. I expect CeeDee Lamb to show why he is the true number 1 wide receiver going forward, especially given the news of Joe Burrow affecting Jamar Chase. But the guy closest on his heels is Puka Nacua, wide receiver of the LA Rams, and you could very well put him as the number 1 wide receiver. 25 points per game through the first 2 weeks, but it is a horrible matchup. He goes up against Vic Fangio, goes up against this Eagles defense, and this is also a mediocre game environment. Only 20.5 implied Rams points on the road, but I mean, Puka Nacua, he's different gravy. 23 plus points in week 1. 27 plus points last week. This guy is the definition of automatic, and I understand it. It is a tough matchup, but you still have the wide receiver kingmaker. You still have Matthew Stafford as your quarterback. And with Nacua, man, I understand that the matchup isn't ideal, but I'm getting shades of 2021 Cooper Kupp. Wide receiver 3 for me this week is Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver of the Detroit Lions. And look, last week, I will eat my crow. I was wrong on Amon-Ra St. Brown. I said that the target competition was growing, and then he goes out there and he scores 3 touchdowns. He scores nearly 40 PPR points. And now we go to Monday Night Football against the Ravens. This is an elite game environment. Single highest game total of the week at 53 points, and the Sharps are actually favoring the over in this game. On top of that, Ravens pass funnel defense. I think we're in store for a shootout on Monday night, and Amon-Ra St. Brown has proven his touchdown equity in this offense. Wide receiver 4, Malik Nabers of the New York Giants going up Sunday Night Football against the Kansas City Chiefs at home. And with Malik Nabers, he has started this season off scorching hot, had that blow-up game against the Cowboys, and now he is the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football and looks like a clear tier 1 option. The Cowboys defense, sure, it may be bad, but Russell Wilson proved that he can play good ball, and it might not matter for Nabers, man. The type of sheer volume he currently is getting, he is being peppered on this offense. 25 targets in his first 2 games. And look, I get it. Like Puka Nacua with the Eagles, the Chiefs represent a tough matchup for Malik Nabers. The Giants are only implied for slightly more than 19 points. But when a wide receiver is this consistent from a volume perspective, he is matchup proof. Malik Nabers, he is matchup proof. And if he keeps playing on this level, he will be in the tier with Lamb and Nacua going forward. But moving on to tier 2, we have 3 wide receivers in this tier: Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. And I consider this to be, the steady wide receiver options. I don't think they quite have the outlook as the guys in the first tier, but I do think they are strong options if they are in your wide receiver 1 spot this week, starting with Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. And obviously, if things were the status quo with Jamar Chase, he would be in tier 1. However, there is a big elephant in the room. You lose Joe Burrow. He's out at least 3 months. Tough blow for the Cincinnati Bengals offense. And with Jamar Chase, he's still an elite talent, but the Bengals projection this week, we do see the hit of Joe Burrow. Usually an offense implied for 24 plus points. They are only implied for 19.25 this week. The Cincinnati Bengals are implied for just as many points as the New York Giants in week 3 of fantasy football. And while Malik Nabers has already proven he can be a high-end wide receiver 1 in fantasy despite the quarterback play, you know, Russell Wilson, not a terrible quarterback, definitely not Joe Burrow. I think Chase can too, but because Malik Nabers has proven it, I do think you have to consider him a tier higher. However, with Jamar Chase, until Browning proves himself for a longer stretch of time, he will be the first name dropped into tier 2. I still like him. He's still wide receiver 5, but I do think the 4 has separated from the pack right now. Number 6, Justin Jefferson on the flip side of the matchup. Very similar case to Jamar Chase, and in fact, in a better matchup going up against the Cincy secondary. However, I have more question marks about Carson Wentz than I do about Jake Browning. Jake Browning at least showed in 2023 that he can operate the Bengals passing offense. Carson Wentz, he is a complete wild card for this game. And on top of that, Justin Jefferson himself simply needs to play better. 6.5 targets per game, 13 PPR points per game. That's simply not going to cut it based off where people had to draft Justin Jefferson. And sooner rather than later, I do think the positive regression will hit for JJ. It may very well happen this week against the Bengals, but I do think there are better options as wide receiver 1 this week. Wide receiver 7, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks going up against the New Orleans Saints, and he is one of the biggest risers in fantasy football right now. In the first 2 weeks of the season, JSN has taken that step to an elite wide receiver 1. 44% seasonal target share, 59% share of the air yards. This guy is basically Northwest Puka Nacua. He is thriving with this Clint Kubiak Seattle Seahawks offense. And we see it in the scoring. 37.7 PPR points this year, despite not scoring a single touchdown. And now the Seahawks are implied for nearly 25 points. At this point, he is a clear mid-range wide receiver 1, and he has the upside, like I said, to join that top 4 tier, to join the CeeDee Lamb, the Puka Nacua, the Amon St. Brown, the Malik Nabers on a week-to-week basis, given the type of volume he is getting. He is getting consistent volume, and because of that, I like the higher on his receiving yards this week over on Underdog. But moving on to the back-end wide receiver 1s, in my tier this week, that's wide receivers 8 through 13. Rome Odunze, Zay Flowers, Drake London, Nico Collins, Brian Thomas Jr., and Ladd McConkey. We'll start at the top. Rome Odunze, wide receiver of the Chicago Bears. And yes, I got a big smile on my mouth because I was a huge Rome Odunze fan coming into the year. And he's met all of my expectations, man. We are getting aggressive on Rome Odunze this week. He is running the entire route tree for the Chicago Bears and being treated like a true wide receiver 1 in fantasy. Number 4 in the league in expected PPR points at wide receiver in the first 2 weeks. And man, the film matches the stats, dude. This guy looks like a new player. Ben Johnson, he went on record. He called him a complete wide receiver, and he is exactly right. We are looking at this route tree, man. 11 targets, 7 receptions. You guys can see the full array of routes he ran. But, dude, this is legit stuff. This is elite number 1 wide receiver stuff. And I already mentioned the matchup. He goes up against the Cowboys defense that allowed 450 passing yards to Russell Wilson and a 38 PPR point performance against Malik Nabers in week 2. Dude, buy the breakout. If you can get Rome Odunze now for wide receiver 17, wide receiver 20 level price tags in your league, this is a set it and forget it wide receiver 1 moving forward, and I expect him to absolutely crush my Cowboys this week. And with that being said, we are going to be taking the higher on his fantasy points, 11.65 for a guy that's the wide receiver 4 in fantasy right now. We are taking that. Smash the higher on 11.65 over on Underdog. Wide receiver 9 for me, another riser similar to Rome Odunze. It is funny, I was a big Rome Odunze guy coming to this year. Corey was a big Zay Flowers guy. He comes in at 9 in that same game environment with Amon St. Brown, highest game total of the entire slate. And Zay Flowers, he's been unbelievable to start this season. 43 PPR points in his first 2 games, but more importantly, he is number 2 in the NFL with a 42% target share, and given the game environment plus the structure of this current Ravens offense, he is a clear wide receiver 1 in fantasy. This Ravens pass attack, it currently revolves around Zay Flowers being the engine of the offense. Isaiah Likely, he's still out for this game. Mark Andrews, man, he looks like an absolute shell of himself. And with the way that Lamar Jackson is currently playing, you are getting the alpha number one wide receiver for a 29 implied point Ravens offense. And Detroit, they're a pass funnel defense, second in EPA against the rush, but only 25th in EPA against the pass this year. If the Ravens, if they can't get the big dog going, I expect Zay Flowers to have a monster game in this one. Wide receiver 10, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons going on the road to play the Carolina Panthers. And I mean, speaking of target upside, I mentioned it with Roma Dunze. I mentioned it with Zay Flowers, Malik Neighbors. Drake London, he is the engine of this Falcons offense. Not the game we wanted to see in week 2, obviously coming off of that short week with the shoulder injury, 22-6, low overall volume. Penix wasn't really airing it out, only 21 attempts. However, in the first 4 games that Drake London played with Michael Penix in his career, we are talking over 13 targets per game. And sure, on the other side, J.C. Horn, I will give my flowers to. J.C. Horn has been playing like one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL. So when Drake London is on the outside, I do actually expect Horn to be able to limit him. However, with Drake London, he's used across the formation. He's used in motion. We saw him used 42.3% of his snaps in the slot against Minnesota. We know that Zach Robinson will move Drake London around to get the best matchup. So I don't actually expect a ton of Horn on London in this game. And we need London to have his blow-up game, but the peripherals point to a true wide receiver one every week, a 30% seasonal target share. Wide receiver 11 is Nico Collins of the Houston Texans going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars on the road. And Nico's production simply hasn't been there through 2 weeks. He made, that sweet toe tap, catch the touchdown against the Bucs. But we just haven't really seen much production for Nico. And I mean, realistically, this Texans passing offense as a whole, because their passing offense has only thrown the ball 51 times across 2 games. And it just simply hasn't looked good. Like, not looking like himself. He's not looking like that rookie CJ Stroud. But I do expect sooner rather than later, the elite talent to win out. I typically would have Nico higher than 11th overall, but the Jags have quietly been top 5 in EPA against the pass this year, and I just simply need to see this offense bounce back. Again, sooner rather than later, I think it will happen. Like Malik Neighbors, Nico Collins is the type of undeniable talent, and I do think if the Texans offense continues to struggle, we will see him be force-fed the football like we see from Malik Neighbors in New York. Wide receiver 12, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars on the flip side of the matchup. Funny because all of last season, I was calling Brian Thomas Jr. Baby Nico. They come in back-to-back, and they, of course, play each other in this game. And he has the volume, man. 19 targets in the first 2 games, but he's just simply been underperforming. And him and Trevor Lawrence just simply have not been able to connect. When you combine that with the fact that now he gets a shadow matchup against Derek Stingley Jr. this week, it's a little bit sketchy. I trust the volume and talent to win out with BTJ like I do with Nico Collins. However, it's just as simple as this, man. BTJ, he needs to start playing better football, and I do think he has the talent to be able to turn it around. Don't overthink your studs through 2 weeks of variance. Wide receiver 13 is Ladd McConkey of the LA Chargers going up against the Denver Broncos, and man, there is both a big pro but a big con with Ladd McConkey in fantasy football right now. The big pro, the Chargers simply refuse to run the football. They are the number 1 team in pass rate over expectation, and they are putting everything on the right arm of Justin Herbert in this passing game. The con, however, Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnson, they look good, and they are providing way more target competition than we expected coming in. I think overall it's a net positive. Ladd McConkey's talent, it's going to win out in the long term. But we do have to note that both QJ and Keenan Allen look good, and we have to dock Ladd McConkey for the time being. However, I think the get-right game is happening soon. He should be able to avoid Pat Surtain a lot in this game. He has a 62% slot rate on the year, and he played 76% of his snaps in the slot against the Raiders. I expect the Chargers to be able to get him off of Pat Surtain. But moving on to tier 4, and I call this tier the solidified wide receiver 2s, the guys that come in at 14 through 19 in my rankings. Teteroa McMillan, Devontae Adams, Mike Evans, A.J. Brown, George Pickens, and locked in there from Thursday Night Football, Tyreek Hill. We'll start off with 14, Teteroa McMillan, and he's gotten off to a hot start in his career. 19 targets, 168 receiving yards in those first 2 games, and he is the clear wide receiver 1 of the Carolina Panthers, and the target competition at this point is simply non-existent. His next closest competitor for targets right now is Hunter Renfrow, who was signed off the street 2 weeks before the season started. And yes, we do need better days. Bryce Young, he needs to play better moving forward, but the Falcons are without their number 1 corner, AJ Terrell. And if Bryce Young can bounce back, we are talking about serious top 5 upside for Teteroa McMillan this week. He's averaged 14 PPR points per game in spite of not scoring a single touchdown so far. I think this is the week he scores his first touchdown, going up against his divisional rival. Wide receiver 15, Davante Adams of the LA Rams going on the road to play the Philadelphia Eagles, and it's an extremely difficult matchup. Like I mentioned with Puka Nacua, Vic Fangio and the Eagles are no joke, but the Rams may very well be this year's Bengals. Puka and Adams, they have combined for a 68% seasonal target share, and both are top 5 in the NFL right now in terms of their target share. Adams, 157 yards, scored that touchdown. He's been great in these first 2 games, and he averages 16 PPR points per game, in spite of Puka being a 25 point per game player. And yes, this is a matchup downgrade, given that Davante Adams would typically be in that fringe wide receiver 1 status, but he's a stone cold baller. This is a concentrated target share between those Rams' top 2 receivers, and I trust Matthew Stafford to be able to deliver them the football this week. Wide receiver 26 is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he's another potential buy low right now. I mean, Mike Evans, he only has 107 receiving yards, 20.7 points in his first 2 weeks, but he has a 30% target share and 19 overall targets in those first 2 games. Sure, potential shadow coverage from Sauce Gardner in this game, but if Ibuka is limited, Mike Evans can be the entire engine of this Tampa Bay passing attack. On top of that, Mike can flat out just beat Sauce Gardner in his reps. I mean, the Jets are currently 26th in EPA per play against the pass this year, 25 implied Buccaneers points. Surely this is the week that Mike Evans punches a touchdown in. Number 17, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles going up against the LA Rams this week, and he's been downright abysmal, and the Eagles currently operate at a 40% neutral pass rate. It's a slow pace, run-heavy approach, and I have not been impressed with what I have seen from Kevin Patullo thus far. However, with A.J. Brown, when he's healthy, he is one of the 5 best wide receivers on earth, and we saw him earn 8 targets in week 2. However, the Rams on the other side, they've been one of the premier defenses in the NFL to start. They are number 3 in defensive EPA versus the pass, and they've only allowed 363 total pass yards and 1 passing touchdown through their first 2 weeks this year. I believe in A.J. Brown's talent to get him there, but we need to see a lot more from this Eagles passing game, and I think we learn a lot this week against the Rams. Wide receiver 18, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys going up against the Chicago Bears. And I mentioned this with CeeDee Lamb, but this is an elite game environment for the Cowboys passing offense this week. Cowboys Bears, absolute barn burner. You need players in this fantasy matchup, man. This is going to be fireworks. We're talking about potential 41-38, 45-32 level blow up upside. And George Pickens, man, I understand the box score hasn't been the cleanest in the first 2 weeks, but when you contextualize just how much he's done and the fact that he's accounted for 79 defensive pass interference yards on each of those plays, man, if the defender didn't contact him early, if the defender didn't impede his opportunity to make the catch, we're talking about 177 yards and 1 receiving touchdown through those first 2 weeks. And now I mentioned the Bears secondary, who has every priority to shut CeeDee Lamb down or at least slow him down. I expect George Pickens to get a ton of one-on-one coverage and for Dak Prescott to stretch the defense. And then wide receiver 19, I did have Tyreek Hill locked in on Thursday Night Football. 10 targets, 5 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and did score a touchdown in that game. And he was bailed out by a touchdown, but man, like that Dolphins offense, it is such a hard watch right now. Like they kept the game close, but that passing attack looks absolutely broken. I mean, Tua Tagovailoa, 34 pass attempts, only 146 passing yards. This is not efficient offense. And Tyreek himself, man, he simply doesn't look like that guy that broke fantasy in 2023. The volume, it has returned. I think he needs to be considered, a wide receiver 2-3. But until this passing offense looks better, I cannot raise him higher than this in my rankings. But moving on to tier 5, I classify this tier as the wide receiver 2-3s in fantasy. Low-end wide receiver 2s, high-end wide receiver 3s, they kind of meld together in my opinion this week. Garrett Wilson, Jamison Williams, T. Higgins, DK Metcalf, Ricky Pearsall, Deebo Samuel, Cortland Sutton, and DJ Moore are the names consisting of this tier this week. We'll start off at the top. Garrett Wilson, wide receiver of the New York Jets, going on the road to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And don't get me wrong, if we did have a healthy Justin Fields in this game, Garrett Wilson, he would be much higher than number 20. I mean, given his level of play, given the fact that the Bucs are a pass funnel defense, he would be much higher, man. 16 points per game so far this year. He has looked good. However, without Justin Fields in this game, I have a significant worry for how Tyrod Taylor is going to be playing. Only 18.5 implied points. Until I see what Tyrod Taylor can do, I can't have Garrett Wilson higher than this. He typically would be in the top 15, top 17, 18 area, but I do think you have to dock him a couple spots given Tyrod is starting. Wide receiver 21, Jamison Williams of the Detroit Lions going on the road to play Baltimore. this is the elite game environment. I mean, I mentioned Chicago versus Dallas. This actually has a higher game total. I mentioned it with Amon-Ra. I mentioned it with Zay Flowers. You want to be targeting this Lions-Ravens game on Monday Night Football. And Jameson Williams is one of the biggest fear factor players in fantasy. In this type of game environment with a high total, this is where we see Jameson Williams come out to play. And sure, he's a bit more volatile than the other wide receivers in this range. But we saw last week, like when the pressure is off, Jameson Williams can go out there, be the ceiling raiser of your offense. We saw the big plays can come in bunches. He can score on any given touch. And it makes me terrified that Zach has him in our matchup in the Flock League. We are playing against each other. Should be a close game. But I am scared of Jameson Williams. And that's why I am taking the higher than 23.5 receiving yards on his longest reception this week. I think the big plays are going to be coming. And I think he catches a 30, 40, potentially 50-yard bomb in this game. Moving on to number 22, we have T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. I mentioned he's going up against Minnesota this week. And in my opinion, he takes a substantially larger hit with the Joe Burrow injury than a guy like Jamar Chase would. Jamar Chase, he's a better wide receiver, and he operates more in that intermediate area of the field. And with T. Higgins, man, for a guy that primarily plays on the boundary, he takes a big hit both in terms of his touchdown equity and the passing target quality for a guy that doesn't create much separation on the outside. Look, I love T. Higgins. He is the perfect ceiling-raising wide receiver when Joe Burrow's healthy. But I also think in the floor scenario, when you have a backup quarterback in, it's more than likely that Jamar Chase gets hyper-fixated on. Then we see T. Higgins become the guy this week. However, Minnesota, they're a pass funnel defense. And like I mentioned with Jamar Chase, maybe Jake Browning is just one of the best backups in the NFL. We saw in 2023, weeks 12 to 18, 267 pass yards per game and 1.5 passing touchdowns per game when he started. It's not Joe Burrow, but not many backup quarterbacks are giving this level of production. We will see what Jake Browning can do against Minnesota this week. Number 23 for me is DK Metcalf, wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers, going to play the New England Patriots. And he's a very interesting case in week 3 because on one hand, he's the clear wide receiver 1 for Pittsburgh. The offense has looked solid to start the year, and the Patriots have been the 31st ranked defense in EPA per play against the pass. However, on the flip side, that was without Christian Gonzalez, who is questionable for this game. There's a very real possibility. Christian Gonzalez, he returned to practice this week. He is questionable, like I said, that Christian Gonzalez plays. I'll say it like this. If Christian Gonzalez is actually out for this game, again, like I said, deemed questionable right now, DK Metcalf would be a fringe top 18, top 20 level wide receiver in my rankings. If Christian Gonzalez is ruled active for this game, I do expect him to shadow DK Metcalf, and he would get downgraded closer to that wide receiver 30 range. So with DK Metcalf, a little bit volatile based off the status of Christian Gonzalez, but he is a fine top 30 play regardless of what happens this week, and I do have him at 23 given the current knowledge we have of the Gonzalez injury. Coming in at 24, Ricky Pearsall, Slicky Ricky of the San Francisco 49ers, going up against the Arizona Cardinals this week, and he's looked good, man. 164 receiving yards, 13 targets in his first 2 games. And Juwan Jennings, like I said at the top of the video, not expected to play this week with that shoulder injury, given the practice status he had all week. With Ricky Pearsall, he's been solid in fantasy, but with no Juwan Jennings this week, who we saw Mac Jones hyper target in week 2, we should see the most involvement of Ricky Pearsall's career, and I'm banking on a true breakout game. I view him as a top 24 option. No Juwan Jennings. What's stopping Ricky Pearsall from getting 12 targets in this game? No Kittle, no Jennings, only McCaffrey to compete for targets with. We are firing up Ricky Pearsall with extreme confidence this week. Wide receiver 25 for me this week is Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders, going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. Deebo, he's been fantastic. 2 touchdowns, 18 targets in his first 2 games as a Commander, and he straight up looks better than Terry McLaurin right now. On top of that, Washington, despite no Jaden Daniels for this game, is still implied for nearly 24 points. And yes, the market is a little bit more optimistic than I am. I do believe in Jaden Daniels versus Marcus Mariota a little bit more than that. I would personally think Washington expectation, 20, 21 type of points. But the market is still confident in Washington. Deebo Samuel has been their number 1 wide receiver. And wide receiver 25, I'm baking in the Jaden Daniels injury. But at the same time, this guy's been the wide receiver 9 in fantasy so far. And he is getting touches in all facets of the game. Wide receiver 26 is Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, going on the road to play the LA Chargers. And he comes in next. He's still the wide receiver 1 for the Broncos, but maybe it's not quite the stranglehold we expected coming into the year. Troy Franklin, he's emerged as a real threat in this offense. And Troy Franklin nearly cracked this list on his own, right? So with Courtland Sutton, I do think we have to expect a downgrade from wide receiver 2 status. On top of that, the matchup, not great. Chargers, they are number 4 in defensive EPA per play against the pass this year. They are extremely difficult to move the ball on through the air. However, I am trusting the larger sample for Courtland Sutton. The large sample since Bo Nix has taken over has pointed to the fact that Courtland Sutton is the alpha of this offense, and even though Troy Franklin looked better last week, I'm willing to give Sutton the benefit of the doubt. Number 27 is DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears going up against the Dallas Cowboys this week. He's getting propped up by this game environment. I already mentioned it in depth. This is a great game. If you have assets in the Chicago Bears-Dallas Cowboys game, I want to be getting them into my lineup. With DJ Moore, he can score on any single touch. And the Cowboys defense is prone for allowing big plays. DJ Moore, he's the number 2 in this offense. Colson Loveland not getting the usage yet. Luther Burden not getting the usage yet. And we know what Rome Odunze is going to do. But there's meat left for DJ Moore to also feast in this game. Now we move on to tier 6, the back-end wide receiver 3s. Wide receivers 28 to 34 in my rankings. Starting with Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. And man, this is not looking good if you have Marv. The 49ers, number 1 in the NFL in defensive EPA per play against the pass. And Marv is coming off a week where he was clamped by J.C. Horn. With Marvin Harrison Jr., man, he's been a considerable faller in my rankings versus where I had him pre-draft. Wide receiver 28 this week. This is a guy that I had in my top 15 wide receivers entering the year. So we just simply need Marv to play better. He's not getting a lot of volume. He has a terrible matchup in this game. But I will remain holding out hope that the light does turn on. It does switch for Marvin Harrison Jr. And we do see the mercurial talent of a prospect that he was coming out of Ohio State. We just haven't seen it, and I'm getting a little bit worried. We're about 20 games into his career, and we haven't seen it yet. Wide receiver 29, Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles going against the LA Rams, and very similar issues that I mentioned to A.J. Brown. The Eagles just simply do not throw the football. With Jalen Hurts, he's attempted 45 passes in the first 2 games of the season. For reference, Dak attempted 52 passes in week 2 against the Giants alone. The passing volume is non-existent in this offense. Kevin Patullo, he's been a big issue, but I still love the talent of Devontae Smith. I still think he is too talented, like A.J. Brown, to rank lower than I have them this week. On top of that, even though the matchup isn't good against the LA Rams, the Eagles are only 3.5-point favorites in this game. Who knows? Maybe the Rams go up in this game. Eagles can't rely upon the run game like they have in recent weeks, and we do see more pass attempts. Even if we can get 30 Eagles pass attempts, I feel confident in Devontae Smith getting there. But for now, I mean, this is definitely something to watch. The Eagles go out there and they throw the ball 22 times again, and we see a slow-paced offense, and the Eagles win this game like 21-17 because they rely on their defense and ground game. It's going to be something to monitor moving forward. Wide receiver 30, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints going up against Seattle this week, and he's commanded 23 targets in his first 2 games, and Spencer Rattler has quietly looked pretty good, especially compared to the expectations. We expected Chris Olave to have the worst quarterback play in the league. And Spencer Rattler's been more than adequate. I think he's perfectly fine. I think he has looked much better than the expectations. However, the Saints are only implied for 17 points in this game, and that's a huge issue for the ceiling of Chris Olave. If we see repeated, quick 3-and-outs, lack of touchdown equity in this game, however, 11.5 targets per game, that absolutely plays in PPR. And at very worst, he's a solid flex option in your league. And same thing applies to Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders. He averages 15.2 PPR points per game this season, and he has 22 targets in those first 2 games. However, Washington, they are top 10 in defensive EPA against the pass. And Brock Bowers did see his snap rate return to normal last week. Only 51% of the snaps in week 1. He played 77% of the snaps coming off of his injury. And with Jacoby Myers, he's a solid floor in PPR leagues, but I am curious how his involvement goes moving forward with Brock Bowers getting healthier and Brock Bowers returning to full form. Wide receiver 32, Keenan Allen of the LA Chargers going up against Denver, and he has gotten off to a scorching start to the year. He has straight up outscored Ladd McConkey. And while I don't think that continues, I do think Ladd asserts himself as the wide receiver 1 sooner rather than later. Even if Ladd does do that, Keenan Allen's very well a solid wide receiver 3 flex PPR option moving forward. 129 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 17 targets in these first 2 games. Allen is trustworthy, man, and both he and Ladd McConkey will split snaps in the slot. Ladd McConkey, I mentioned about a 62% slot rate in the first 2 games this year. Keenan Allen at a 48.3% slot rate. So with Keenan Allen, he's playing well. Chargers are flinging the rock, and they only throw the ball to wide receivers. A 73% combined target share between Keenan Allen, Ladd McConkey, and Quentin Johnson this year. Wide receiver 33 is Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders going up against Vegas this week, and he is the clear wide receiver 2 on Washington right now. Let's not get it twisted. Deebo Samuel has straight up been better than Terry McLaurin, and while I don't think it's a foregone conclusion the rest of the season will look like this, Given how both of them have played in the first 2 games, you could not rank Terry McLaurin above Deebo Samuel. With Terry McLaurin, 13 targets, 75 receiving yards through 2 games, and now gets Marcus Mariota as his starting quarterback. And with McLaurin, I think you got to treat him like a low-end wide receiver 3 until he shows he can straight up play better than Deebo Samuel. And at 34, we have Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Like I mentioned with Mike Evans, I do expect Emeka Egbuka to be limited in his snaps this week. That hip and groin issue, it is absolutely no joke. And like this tweet from Deepak says, he also expects a dip in snap count going into this week's games. Emeka Egbuka obviously ruled into the contest, but we cannot expect the snap share that he had in the first 2 games of the year. But if we do get a report though, maybe we go into Sunday and we get like a Jay Glazer report. Emeka Egbuka, he's fully returned to health. He's going to have no issue in his snaps this week. Egbuka would go up to a top 20 to 24 option, but given what we know right now, given the fact that I'm operating on limited snaps, I do have Egbuka as my wide receiver 34. And then the final tier of my rankings, the wide receivers 35 to 40, aka the flexes. And I can kind of breeze through these. I mean, 35, Quentin Johnson, he's a very good option in my opinion, but he is the one expected to see the most Pat Surtain in this game. However, Quentin Johnson, big play upside, over 24 implied Chargers points. That makes him a boom bust flex option. We've seen what the highs look like. There is just a little more risk than usual because Pat Surtain is a stone cold baller. Wide receiver 36, Travis Hunter. And speaking of boom bust, man, I mean, Travis Hunter, he has not been what I expected coming to the year just yet. However, he was missed on 2 big separate touchdowns, both that ended up in interceptions against Trevor Lawrence. Week 1, we saw it. About an 84-yard touchdown would have been on the play. Week 2, we saw it again. Big play made on defense. Realistically, with Travis Hunter, though, we only saw about 60% of the snaps in week 2. And that's my main question. Like, how many snaps is he going to play? I cannot rank him as a top 24 option until I see the consistent snaps week to week. And given the fact that the Jacksonville Jaguars play Houston this week, Derek Stingley's probably going to spend a lot of time on Brian Thomas Jr., the Jaguars need him to play offense. So hopefully we do see him out there. Hopefully we do see an 80+% route share because Travis Hunter has the talent to break the slate if he can play enough offense. 37, Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants. He goes up against the Kansas City Chiefs on Sunday Night Football. And Wan'Dale Robinson versus Travis Hunter is a decision point that I have to make in the Flock League. And I do admit, this is a very close decision because even though Wan'Dale Robinson, he's getting the consistent usage, he is the better option at this point in fantasy football. It is a terrible game environment for this Giants offense. Sure, Russell Wilson, he looked good last week, but the Chiefs are absolutely no joke defensively. However, with Wan'Dale Robinson, what we do like to see, he's getting more downfield usage. He's kind of being the Tyler Lockett for Russell Wilson in the context of this offense. And I think Wan'Dale Robinson should be viewed as a startable PPR flex with top 30 weekly upside given the current usage he's getting. Wide receiver 38 for me was Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. On Thursday night, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 39 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. And he scores, but he's just a volatile flex option. He was dealing with an injury coming into the game. Tua Tagovailoa doesn't look good. He's going to be a fringe top 40 wide receiver moving forward, and you're not going to feel good about starting him any week. Wide receiver 39, Cooper Kupp of the Seattle Seahawks going up against New Orleans. Last week we saw it. 9 targets for Cooper Kupp, 16 PPR points against the Steelers. And JSN, he has been doing it all so far, but does he exactly continue a 44% target share and a 59% air yard share? If your answer to that question is yes, you better be ranking JSN as the wide receiver 1 in fantasy moving forward. More than likely, in my opinion, JSN regresses back to that 30 to 35% target share, 40-ish% air yard share, and I think Cooper Kupp is still the wide receiver 2 in Seattle, despite Torrey Horton scoring last week and looking good. He's still the 2 in usage, and he is a fringe top 40 level wide receiver for me. Coming in at 40 on the dot is Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans going up against the Indianapolis Colts. And man, Ridley has been flat out brutal. On top of that, Elikayo Manor only has 1 less target than Calvin Ridley this year, and now the matchup he gets is against the number 7 defense in EPA per play against the pass with the Indianapolis Colts. I think with Ridley, he's due for a bounce back anytime soon, but I do worry that it happens against Indianapolis. However, with Cam Ward and a young quarterback's development, that is not linear. There's the very real possibility anytime soon, Cam Ward takes that step, breaks out, and looks like a much better quarterback moving forward for Calvin Ridley. But until that happens, he is a clear wide receiver 4 in fantasy. But either way, these were my top 40 wide receivers. If you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. And if you guys want access to all of my rankings moving forward, head on over to flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSC to get started. And if you do become a member over on the site, you will get access to our full weekly rankings, our start sit manifesto, our rest of season rankings, and all of the tools available on the site, such as the trade calculator. And also, I mentioned my pick'em entry for wide receivers this week. Pair it with this Russ gimme pick over on Underdog. Taylor fade my picks today. Promo code FSE. The link is in the description. But with that being said, peace out. We'll talk to you soon.